Should we should be live. I'm just gonna do some refreshing.
Fantastic.
Let's just make sure. Okay, it looks like we're live on Facebook. Um, although somebody I know is not on Facebook anymore.
Right.
Live on YouTube and live on Twitter, and we should be live on LinkedIn, which I will get to eventually. Okay, so hello, Imaginers. I am chatting with my friend Aaron Hockley. I have known Aaron for a very long time. He and I are very similar human beings. We're both photographers, right? But we are also both very interested in the tech side of the photography industry, and have been for many years. And so this is going to be more of a tech conversation than what you might be used to from previous live streams to the ImagenAI community. But this is going to be a fun one, and it's one that I know I'm excited for, and I think many of you will be interested in hearing some of the conversation. Aaron, while I just dig into making sure we're live in all the different places, can you please share with everybody watching a little bit about yourself?
Sure thing. Great to have you all here. I'm glad to be joining Scott and with Imagine to talk about AI and photography. So my name's Aaron Hockley. I'm a photographer, started out as a hobbyist, got into it professionally as well. My background prior to that was in technology and software development, though. And so as I got into the photo world, I naturally brought that tech background with me. And over the years, I kind of got to a place where in the photo world, I was seen as the techie guy. And in the tech world, I was seen as the photo guy. And so a few years ago, I just decided to own that and set up a website called Tech Photo Guy. And that's kind of the brand I use at this point. I spend a lot of time helping photographers with the technical side of being a professional photographer in 2022, whether that's helping them figure out their online presence, their website, social media, online marketing, or the technical sides of using the computer tools that we use to help create impactful images. So yeah, that's kind of me at the space, the intersection right there. And so this kind of thing is right up my alley.
Awesome. So before we dive in, just to remind everybody, if you're watching on Facebook, on the Facebook page of ImagenAI or in the Facebook community, because we're going live using Restream, Facebook requires you to click this one link once, and you never have to do it again. So before leaving a comment or a question, please grant Restream permission so that we can see your name. If you do comment in the live chat on Facebook, you need to go to chat.restream.io/FB. That you can see that up on the screen right now. Just go there. You have to do it once. You'll never have to do it again. And we will see your name. Otherwise, we will see Facebook user or anonymous or something like that. So please be sure to do that. And if you have a question for Aaron, please comment with a Q: before you do the question, so we can just filter any comments that come in, and we can see that it's a question. Okay, so we've got a bunch of topics that we want to talk about. We were going to do this at Imaging USA. Both you and I canceled going to Imaging USA, so we scheduled to now. So you briefly talked about this in your little introduction about yourself. Can you talk a little bit more about what Tech Photo Guy is? You've had it now for a few years. You've gone through a variety of different website changes, and I think Tech Photo Guy has been the constant one. The theme has been there over the years consistently.
Right.
So can you talk more about what the website is?
Yeah, so techphotoguy.com is where I publish information for photographers to help them make the most of the technical side of being a photographer, whether that's the technical aspects of making images or whether that's the technical aspects of having a professional photography business in our current times, which means that you need things like, a website and social media presence and online services to help support your photography and things like that. And so at techphotoguy.com, you can sign up for an email. I send a weekly email every weekend called Focusing Photography that brings usually some thoughts and analysis on what's going on along with resources or interesting things that have caught my eye in the previous week for photographers. I have a blog on my website. I update that usually about a couple times a month on average with, more in-depth articles and resources. I have a resources page there as well that kind of brings together all of my favorite, services, products, things that I use and that I recommend for people to, again, just, have as smooth of an experience as possible, whether you're a younger person who grew up with computers, kind of a digital native, or whether you're a more experienced photographer who used to shoot film and, moved into the digital world and is still trying to figure out all this computer stuff. Either way, there's a lot of options out there when it comes to the tech side of photography. And I'm a big fan of finding solutions that work and supporting those companies and, focusing on the creative side, which is where we can really make the most impactful images and, deliver the best services to our clients.
For sure. Yeah. And so one of the things that you've been talking about a lot in your content, and something that we're going to be talking about a lot today, is AI, which obviously at ImagenAI, we are big fans of how AI can help our lives as photographers. Can you share some of the uses that you see AI playing in photography?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic, and it's one that I really started diving into hard, I want to say about 3 years ago. And one of the primary outputs of that is that late in 2021, I published a book on AI and photography called The Computer Ate My Photos. And as we look at AI in photography, there's really kind of two places, two broad categories of where it's there. One is that we're all already using it, even if we don't realize it, even if we haven't made the choice to do so. And that's because, when we talk about, I guess maybe we ought to start by saying, what is artificial intelligence, right? There's a lot of definitions out there. The one that I like, is essentially the concept or the idea that a computer can make decisions on your behalf on things that, were previously only thought possible to be done by humans. And so as the technology evolves, kind of what is considered AI might evolve as well. But if we look at types of things that computers and computer-based systems can help us with as a photographer, there's things in your camera or in your smartphone, decisions, settings, features at the time of image capture where we can trust the computer and our camera to help make some of those decisions, right? We can trust a feature that's maybe going to lock the autofocus onto someone's face or onto their eyes and follow that as they move within the frame. That's something where previously a photographer would have to be manually setting that focus point and then paying attention to that and doing on their own. But now with our current cameras, it can do that kind of a thing. With our smartphones, whether it's an iPhone or a modern Android phone or anything like that, the reason that we can make such great images from such a tiny camera sensor and such a tiny lens is because of computational photography, which is essentially computer assisted photography, where the camera software in our iPhone or in our other smartphone does a whole lot of computations when we, tap that shutter button or click that shutter button, and uses those computations to give us an image that looks far better than we might expect from an image sensor the size that exists in those phones. And then after our image capture, this is where, services like, ImagenAI come in and other products where, AI can help us with kind of the management and the editing of those images as well, right? So if you're a wedding photographer who comes home from a long wedding with 6,000 images between you and your second shooter, how do you sort through those, right? I mean, you can do it manually, but if you can use some software to help you filter out the obvious rejects, or maybe filter out if you've got a bunch of similar images, which one looks like it might be the best, and then when you decide it's time to edit, maybe you took that 6,000 images and you filtered it down to, 200 that you really want to brush up and make look as good as you can. Well, you can manually edit 200 images one by one, or you can trust, some editing software to make some smart decisions on that on your behalf. And, whether that's a plugin that's going to do, skin retouching automatically, or whether that's, something like ImagenAI, where it's going to, try and apply a style that, it has learned based on your past edits. And so, at Image Capture, the AI can help us with managing our image collection, right? We used to spend a lot of times adding metadata and keywords and things like that to our photos. And, I think the farther we get into the future, the less and less we're going to see that as required, right? Because,
Yep.
I can open up Apple Photos on my iPhone and tell it to find me photos of waterfalls, even if I've never tagged any of those images with the word waterfall, right? So,
Right.
And that's through, that machine learning and the computer being able to figure out, oh, this is a photo of a waterfall. This is a photo of a dog. This is a photo of, nighttime or whatever that may be. So, we're already using AI, whether we're choosing to or not. And for those of you that are really into the tech side of things, you can make some choices around products and services and things like that if you really want to embrace that. Imagine is just one, but there are other products that are out there. I mean, Luminar named their flagship product last year Luminar AI, right? Topaz Labs keeps renaming a bunch of its plugins to, the plugin for, the plugin that used to just be, Topaz Denoise is now Topaz Denoise AI. And so,
Right.
Everybody's embracing the AI thing, and there is some technology behind it. It's not just a marketing buzzword.
Do you think that artificial intelligence will replace the work of photographers?
Right? Are we going to get, anytime we have a discussion about, technology advances and automation,
That's where it goes.
There's always that question in the back of our
Yeah.
minds of, crap, am I going to get automated out of a job by a robot?
Right.
And I think what I would say is, photographers aren't going away, right? I don't think we're going to be at a point in our lifetimes where instead of hiring a wedding photographer, somebody's going to hire some sort of a robot that's going to rove around the wedding and take all the photos for you. That said, some of the tasks that photographers maybe spend time doing right now might be ripe to be replaced by automation in some ways. And depending on the type of photography that you do, it may affect you in different ways. But we talked about sorting and culling images after a shoot, right? I mean, that's something that we currently do. Most people currently do in a somewhat manual fashion. But if we can, tie a plug-in or use software that can help us do that, that will speed that up, right? And so maybe that's something that you have an assistant in your photo studio, and they're the ones who unfortunately got stuck with that task of spending, 2 or 3 hours going through those 6,000 photos and doing that. Well, if a plug-in can do that in 5 minutes, great. You just freed up 3 or 4 hours of time. You don't have to pay somebody to do that.
As I'm listening to you talk about all this, it made me think. I don't know what triggered this in my mind, but photographers that are using TTL for their wireless lighting are basically using a very, very simple version of some sort of AI, right? And that's an area that's only going to get better and better as modern sensors get put into these strobes and flashes and whatnot, where right now TTL is pretty good across the board. But there's going to be a point as AI gets better and sensors get better where TTL is going to be in some ways better than a photographer manually controlling their lights. I don't think they'll ever get rid of the ability to control, even on TTL, being able to go up or down or whatever. But I have a feeling that very soon, especially with companies like Profoto that are really pushing the limits of what wireless lights can do, I have a feeling that TTL is going to become a TTL AI that, it'll be hard to compete with.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned TTL. I think that's a great example of something that people don't think of it as AI, probably, right? Like, tell me what AI you're using. Very few people are going to be like, oh, well, I use TTL Flash. But what's interesting is just last week. So Joe McNally just released a book that's basically his life's work, and he narrates it as well. And I got a copy in advance because I'm in theory, going to have the opportunity to interview Joe and talk about it here pretty soon, and that's going to be fun. But I actually keyed in. He's got a chapter where he talks about kind of the evolution of using TTL, and the title of that chapter is "Trust the Machine." Right, and that ties right in with a lot of how automation goes. Right, the first version of an automatic feature usually isn't perfect. It has some notable flaws. Think about the first version of portrait mode that Apple released back with the iPhone 8. It was pretty rough. It often did screwy things like with somebody who wears glasses or the edges of hair, or maybe it's going to cut off an ear because it doesn't isolate the subject from the background quite right. It was kind of rough. But since then, they've learned from that. They've had millions of photos photographed with it that can be analyzed, and and it's gotten really good, right? The current versions of portrait mode in the iPhone or in current versions of Android are pretty darn good. And with any sort of automation, it's often like that, is that the first versions are kind of rough, and then they get better, and then they get better. And we get to a point where, yeah, we're going to trust the machine, right? We're going to hit that auto, we're going to hit that auto button in our editing software to see what it does automatically, and maybe use that as a starting point. I gave a presentation to the American Society of Photographers a few months ago, and we talked about AI things. And one of the gentlemen who was in the audience asked afterwards, he's like, well, what does this mean for a purist like me? And it's an interesting question, because what does it even mean to be a photography purist, right? It's all based on, in your own head, where you decide to draw that line. Because, are you not a purist if you use any of the camera assisted, non-manual modes on your camera? If I use shutter priority or aperture priority, does that make me not a purist? If I use autofocus, am I not a purist, right? Now I'm trusting the camera to focus for me. Do I need to switch back to being fully manual, right? And so I think a lot of it just has to do with our own personal experience with photography, and when we got into it, and what we saw as the basic starting level. Because there are things that somebody who's getting into photography in 2022 are going to assume are things like, well, the camera just does this because this is part of what it does, right? That
right.
are maybe brand new features that didn't exist when you got into photography or when I got into photography. And so we see that as a newfangled innovation, right? And so when we talk about, what does the future look like? Are we going to be replaced by AI? Overall, no. Are there some things that we do now that will? Yes. Are there genres that will be impacted? So Square, the payment processing company, right? You might use it for your own photography business, or undoubtedly you've been to lots of small business vendors that have the Square readers and things like that. Square's done a couple interesting things. One that they've done, and I wrote about this in the book, is that a couple of years ago, they launched basically a product photography service where if you're a business using Square for your payment processing, you can ship them little products. If you just need basic catalog type images on a white background, I think they charge $19 a thing to do that, right?
Yep.
Well, if you're a professional product photographer and that's the type of service you offer, are you going to be able to compete on $19 a product? Maybe not. What's even more interesting now is Square's released an iPhone app to do the same thing at home. You set that product on a white background and use the Square app, and it generates an image that you can then load into your Square payment system or onto your Square-powered product website, bypassing the photography side of it as well. And so if you're a product photographer and all you really do is just basic catalog photos on white, yeah, there's a chance that some of your business might get automated away by other solutions. And that's the kind of thing where you need to look at what real value can I deliver to the client? Because if the value that you're delivering to the client is just that you know how to use a camera really well, or that you know light really well, that stuff becomes less valuable of a professional skill set every year as the technology gets better and better.
Yeah, it's one of those things that by Square doing this, all it's doing in the photography industry is making photographers take it to the next level. Stylize your product photos rather than just throw them on a white, background. It is interesting that Square went in that direction. I know a lot of people were like, "Why?" But for them, it makes sense. For
Right. For
their
them,
business,
it
it makes
makes
sense.
sense because it removes a barrier for somebody who's going to
Yeah.
be their customer. I mean, the more they enable their customers, the small businesses to sell more stuff, the more money they make, right?
Yep.
So any tool or friction that they can remove is better. And I think there's a good, business lesson there for photographers, right? I
Mhm.
mean, you're not just selling photos to your clients, right? You're not selling a piece of paper to hang on the wall. What you're really
Yeah.
selling is that memory, that experience, that and if you do commercial work, it's like, what's really your client's goal with commercial work? It's not to have a photo of their own product or to have a photo of their office or a photo of their event. They have an ultimate purpose. They want to use that for marketing. They want to use that to further their own goals. And so anything you can do as a photographer that helps them closer towards their own goals and not just make a picture, that makes you more valuable to them. And I think that's where
Yeah.
photographers are going to need to focus, is what really is the value you're delivering, not just a technically correct photo.
Yeah. So, outside of the photographic process, outside of the editing process, the culling process, all that stuff, what are other areas in photography businesses where AI could play a role for us, for photographers?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are at least a couple where maybe we're going to potentially actively choose to do something, and I think there are lots of other areas where it's happening behind the scenes and we don't even think about it, right? So,
Yeah.
like, if you use Facebook ads or if you use Google ads, that involves a machine learning algorithm that's going to look at your ad and who you think you're targeting with that ad, and that computer is going to make decisions on who it shows that advertisement to and when and how and things like that. And you know Google or Facebook or whatever service you're using for those online ads, they obviously have a financial interest in making your ad as successful as possible so that you keep buying more ads from them. But they're using AI and machine learning to help them serve that up, and they have been for a long
Yeah.
time, right? And so, like,
Yep.
that's an area where, as a photographer, you're going to benefit from that AI, whether you realize it or not. If you produce, online content of any sort, whether that is blog posts or if you do YouTube videos, that you have a YouTube channel where you talk about your photography, or if you if you do Instagram stories or Snapchat or anything like this, there are AI things that are happening with that can help you out right now. There are explicit, like, AI content generation things where you can have it help write that blog post for you if you want. On the other hand, there are also AI tools that can help take some of what you're doing and maybe make it accessible in other ways, right? So if you're going to do a YouTube video, cool. Well, get that get an AI generated transcript of that, and maybe that can turn into a blog post for you, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe that can help
Yep.
that get indexed by the search engines better. Or, like, if you're going to do an Instagram story, you can turn on the feature where it automatically detects what you're saying and puts those words onto that Instagram story, so that you don't just then have the audio, the audio of you also have the visual. So if
Yeah.
somebody's looking at your story with audio off, or if they're hearing impaired or something like that, it makes your content more accessible. And so there's lots of little ways like this where we're not, necessarily explicitly making a decision of, like, yes, I'm going to use artificial intelligence for this because I'm artificially intelligent, or whatever that means. But we're benefiting from all of that. And so there are a lot of places just in our modern business world where, AI is working on our behalf.
Yeah. Personally, I'm using tools like Grammarly for when I
Mm, another great
um
example. Yeah.
yeah, so Grammarly is like a word processor, a Google Doc, a Microsoft Doc, whatever you want to call it, but it's and there's a browser extension so you can actually use it outside of its own editor. But basically, it's an AI-based grammar, spelling, plagiarism checker, all these different things, and it uses AI to do it. There's also content creation tools
Mhm.
that can give you some starting points using AI to create blog posts or to create a landing page or things like that. I'm just trying to think what else I'm personally using
Yeah, I
that
mean,
that
people talk about doing, like, I mean, if you're doing like search marketing, right? I mean, keyword research, some of the like keyword research and topical tools will look at, not just what's out on search engines right now, but, based on what's there, what might be other ways, other related things that you could create that would help you from an SEO perspective and things like that. That's another good example
Yeah.
that came to mind.
We talked about, AI in the photography itself. We've talked about AI in like the photography business a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
We're using AI in our daily lives. I mean, just being on Facebook and Instagram, right? So YouTube,
Right.
all these things. We're using it, as you said, whether we like it or not, we're using it. But there's even things. So unfortunately, this week my wife and I had to replace our washer and dryer, and which is always fun. And I almost didn't have a choice to get one that was a smart washer and dryer. They barely make them without it anymore
Mm-hmm.
in the average consumer models. And again, whether I like it or not, it has AI in it. It's using sensors to determine the weight, the volume of clothes that are in it, and then using AI to figure out, all these algorithms to figure out how much it needs to actually wash.
Right.
With all of it.
How wet are these clothes? How long do I need to dry them?
Yeah.
Right. How long? I mean, we know that towels take longer to dry than, a lightweight t-shirt, but it's not just brute forcing that. Yeah. It's got sensors and it's making decisions that change based on what's happening. Yeah, AI is fascinating, and there's lots of applications of it. Some of which we think are like so like self-driving cars is a big, super obvious application of a lot of different AI technologies working together. A lot of those are photo-based AI technologies, right? Obviously, it needs to have cameras and sensors that can tell what's going on around the car. But there are other areas, right? There are I mean, even, with photo-based AI, right, there are, traffic cameras and speed cameras and things like that are going to start making decisions on our behalf. And some of those areas are areas where we start getting into kind of the ethical, privacy concern, legal concern side of artificial intelligence, which is a whole nother ball of wax to talk about. That, I mean, we could have an hour-long live stream on that and not even touch on everything. But because we're seeing it in a lot of different places. And so yeah, I mean, like, you mentioned your washer and dryer. I mean, televisions are another thing, right? I mean, a couple of years, I guess it was probably 3-4 years ago now, it was time to upgrade the TV in our main living room. And went out there and it's like, well, what's available? And like everything is a smart TV now, whether you want it to be or not. And it comes with sensors, and it comes with, potentially, capabilities to monitor what you've done and make suggestions on what it thinks you might want to watch based on what you've done. And, and again, like, there can be a lot of benefits to that. And again, there can also be questions that get raised around, well, what data is it collecting on you, and who is it sending to, and what are those organizations doing with that data, and then making decisions on your behalf that you may or may not be fully understanding or have consented to. And so, it's everywhere for better or for worse. And I think most of the gain, most of the time we can say that, yeah, we're getting a net gain out of this, but I think there are often a lot of kind of unintended consequences that do need to be considered as well.
One that blows my mind, which could be used in a person's house, could be used in a photography studio. I would never personally get this, but it still blows my mind that this is possible, is the smart refrigerators that actually can detect what is in your refrigerator, and when it's low, orders a replacement for you.
Right.
That is amazing. It's amazing.
Totally. Yeah. And, and on one hand, it's like, well, yeah, that totally makes sense. If I'm almost out of ketchup, order me a replacement ketchup, or, add it to my grocery list. And then it's and that way I can pick it up if I'm at the store locally or whatever that may be. Right. Like, there's obviously those smart home technologies in general, in a lot of different ecosystems, whether it's, Apple or Google or Amazon or any of these other systems that have, lots of lights and sensors and motion detectors
Yep.
and temperature
Facial recognition.
controls and facial and
Yeah.
back in the, I think it was in the late 1990s, there was a movie called Antitrust that was loosely based on what was a good tech story in the 90s of, oh, Microsoft is this big evil corporation and all that. And in the movie Antitrust, there was this company that was, Microsoft-esque. Of course, they wouldn't actually call them out as Microsoft, but one of the things in the movie, one of the new technologies they developed that was totally futuristic and not possible at the time was that, as you walked into a room, there were like digital artwork displays on the walls that based on who you were when you walked into the room, it knew what kind of art you liked. And so the art in the room as you walked in would change based on who you were. And like, that was totally futuristic 20 years ago. And now it's like, oh, well,
Yeah, we're getting there.
my camera knows who I am.
Yeah.
It could learn what kind of, that's not that far off, right? If,
Yeah.
if I can talk to, that smart speaker that I have in my office with a name and it can tell my voice different from my wife's voice.
It can play music based on your taste.
Exactly. What decisions can it make on my behalf? So yeah, it's all around us. And
I mean,
interesting stuff.
Yeah, the new Canon mirrorless literally is analyzing its users' eyeballs on a regular basis. Like literally, every time you put your eye up to the viewfinder, it sees your eyeball.
Right.
So it's that could do a lot. That could do a lot in the besides from what it's doing now. There's things that could come from it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. There are a lot of things in the tech world where when they're new and novel, we think of them as a specific new and novel thing. And then at some point they just become common and they're no longer new and novel. And it just becomes an accepted thing that computers do, right? I mean, there was a time when like facial detection in cameras was cutting edge stuff, right? Like now, I think now if a camera company released any sort of a current, standalone camera without like facial detection for like focus purposes, it'd be like, what the heck happened there? Like, how did you, like, that's just table stakes, right? Like it's expected, and we will see the same things, I think in the photo space and in our lives where, stuff that once was, it was part of the luxury package in your car and now it's going to be in the base model or, whatever that is. And so, if you don't like change and stuff coming at you rapidly, unfortunately, it's an unfortunate time to be in our world because it's happening, in the photo space, in the computer space, in the internet space. But everywhere in the appliance space, in the car space, in the home technology space. Yeah.
So we've talked a whole bunch about variety of AI already. So I'm going to ask you a very blunt question. Do you think that AI can make photography better?
I think it can. I think that it can help us I think it can help photographers overall in two ways. One is I think it lowers the barrier to being able to get from the picture, the vision that you have in your head to executing on that vision. Because, if we go back 30, 40 years, right? Like, how did professional photographers make a living 30 years ago? At the time my senior portraits got taken, right, in like early 1990s, professional photographers, were able to set themselves apart for a few reasons, but a couple of, one of them was that they had the equipment, right? Like professional photography equipment was really darn expensive. It wasn't accessible to consumer. Yeah, there were consumer cameras, but they weren't nearly as good as what a professional was going to have. And professional photographers had access to a pro lab, right? We're not talking about the little photomat booth down on the corner in the neighborhood, but we're talking about like an actual pro lab. As far as, and so the barriers to doing really good photography were a lot higher. And then digital cameras came along, and digital cameras got significantly cheaper, and the internet came along, which made distribution of files significantly easier. You know, that's not to say that there isn't still a place for a nice piece of wall art, or that there isn't still a place for you know, some other things, but for the average consumer, all that stuff got easier and cheaper. You know, I mean, I can walk into Walmart right now and get a $300 camera
Yeah.
and put it on full auto mode, and it's going to make pretty good pictures in a
Yeah.
lot of scenarios, right?
So I think you know, building on what you just said about it getting you from what's in your head, you know, like, you know, the visualized, like, so you can actually see it, the final product. It also minimizes the barrier to entry. So
it does, which is a there's two sides to that, right? I mean, if you're somebody who wants to get into it, or if you're trying to get somebody new into the photography world, it makes it easier for them to do so. On the other hand, if you're a professional photographer, you know, there's an aspect of it that we can't deny, which is that some of the stuff you used to be able to charge money for, you can't charge money for anymore, right? And you know, you mentioned at one point earlier, you were talking about how stuff was just getting better and better every year. I mean, so I'm pretty involved in the Professional Photographers of America, and they do formal image competitions, which I've competed in for several years now, and I've actually now gone through training and judging those. And you know, you can look at the level of the work that kind of met that bar, you know, met a certain bar 10 years ago. And that work, if you were to enter that same work today, isn't going to meet that same bar, because the expectations, the quality overall of what photographers have been able to create, both from, you know, what their camera can capture, what they're able to do in editing, and the creative aspects as well. But like, you know, that level of quality, that threshold for what we say is, you know, I mean, in the PPA world, you know, it's deserving of a merit is kind of the minimum standard that one tries to meet in competition. But like, that bar evolves over time. And so, as photographers, you know, we are in situations where, you know, again, like, the client doesn't just need you to capture a technically correct photo, because the ability to capture a technically correct photo is getting easier and easier every year. There's, you know, I mean, your iPhone can capture a technically correct photo in a whole lot of situations right now, right? And that's something that, you know, billions of people have in their pocket. And, you know, when you go to an event, you know, half the people at the event have got in their pocket, right? So what can you do as a photographer that distinguishes you from somebody at the event who pulls out their iPhone and, you know, takes a photo with that? And that's where, you know, you're going to need to bring that creative juice to the, you know, to the picture, pun intended. Or you're going to need to really be able to deliver on the value that that client is looking for. And it's, you know, depending on the client, that could be a different thing, right? If you're photographing a maternity session, it's very different than doing corporate headshots, which is very different than doing you know, wedding photography, which is different than doing product photography, which is different than creating fine art images that you want to sell to art collectors. And so understanding what your client's really looking for, what's kind of their underlying motivation, you know, is important. And then making that process as easy and smooth and possible, or as easy and smooth and, you know, as possible. Right. So slight kind of related to this diversion. We talked about places where AI is interesting, and I referenced this in the book as well. But a few years ago, Google came out with a study, and basically they developed an algorithm that could look at similar pictures, and the computer could decide, I believe it was about 80% accuracy, between two similar pictures, which one is a human going to find more pleasing, right? So which of these two photos of the Eiffel Tower is a better photo of the Eiffel Tower? Which of these two photos of this woman is a better photo of this woman? Which of these two photos of, you know, any given thing? And, you know, and about 80% of the time, the computer picked the same one that a human panel. I think there were 200 people in the human panel that they asked to judge the same things. So if a computer can decide which photo is better, Should Google use that data in search engine rankings for photographers, right? If you make better photos as a photographer, if I'm searching for, I mean, you're in New Jersey. If I'm searching for, a New Jersey headshot photographer, and that's something you're trying to rank for in the search engine, if Google thinks your competitor's photos are better according to the computer, should they rank your competitor ahead of you? Well, maybe that should have some impact on the ranking, but I think we all know as photographers, there's a lot more to being a good professional photographer than just the image, right? I mean, maybe your competitor's image is better, but maybe he's a jerk to deal with, right? Maybe he has a habit of not delivering his products on time. Maybe he, does some scammy things, and like all of that are other factors that, that ought to be considered. And so it's not always just the image.
I'm sure they are using some of it, some of that type of AI analysis in their rankings. I do feel like they would be way too judgmental if they were to fully embrace that. But I can almost say with certainty that they're using some sort of something along that lines for sure.
And it gets into kind of a fun philosophical discussion, right? Of like, well, how much making you a better photographer is just the image versus the complete picture of you as as a person and as a photographer and all that, right? I mean,
So with that though, with that potential in mind, with the possible future that you have to start thinking about when it comes to how smart Google, right, for example, which plays a big role in everybody's business, what and how is the best way for photographers to get the most out of AI in their photography, in their businesses? I have my answer, and I can say it in 2 words, but I'm really curious about yours. Mine is embrace it. Just embrace it, because you got no choice.
Right. You're getting it whether you want it or not. You already have it whether you want it or not. And so, I think sometimes people, and you hear these terms, AI, machine learning, computational photography, algorithms, at some point, I mean, they are all actual things. They can all benefit you in some ways. Sometimes they get thrown around just as like marketing buzzwords, maybe a little excessively at times by, different companies, in flyers and announcing products on stage and things like that. But, I think embrace it really is kind of a good summary, because like it's here, and you don't have to, I certainly wouldn't suggest that to be successful in the coming years, you need to go out and download and install and try every new AI related thing the minute it's released, and toss your old camera in the trash and buy a new one because there's a new one that just came out with some new AI features or things like that. But I think what I would say is, you also don't want to be on the other end of that spectrum, right? I mean, you don't want to be that person who, is refusing to use, here's a good example, right? I refuse to use facial detection or eye detection. I've turned all those features off in my camera because I know better than the camera how to get that focus right? Like there are definitely scenarios where, maybe that feature is not going to nail it for you, and you're going to need to override it and do what you need to do. And that's that area where your skill as a photographer can be smarter than the computer. But on the other hand, like the reality is most of the time that Sony chip, that Nikon chip, that, whatever your camera of choice is, it's pretty good, right? And so like if you're taking a stand against a technology, I think you really need to make sure you fully understand said technology. And, I'm not, and again, there certainly are things that happen with technology that maybe it's worth taking a stand against, or maybe it's not. But when you're talking about photography, making images, you don't need to be on the bleeding edge, but you also need to make sure you don't fall too far behind. You can certainly make great photos with a 10-year-old camera that doesn't have a ton of AI in it. And I'm not suggesting that you can't, but I'm also saying that if you replace that 10-year-old camera, I think you owe it to yourself as a smart photographer to learn about it and make the most of what it can do and understand how that works. And, if you have, here's a good example, right? If you've got Creative Cloud and, you can download the version of Photoshop that Adobe announced at Adobe Max, when was it, 3 months ago, maybe, or so, I think it was when that was. Maybe it was a little longer than that at this point, but like, Photoshop and Lightroom both had some pretty significant updates this year. Lightroom got a lot of AI masking features. Photoshop got some really interesting neural filters and things like that. And play around with them, right? Decide that, spend 2 hours on some afternoon and be like, hey, let's take some of my existing images and mess around with some of these new AI features and see what it does. And what you're probably going to find is, there's probably some times that, it can really do some interesting stuff. And you might find some places where it's like, oh yeah, that didn't really work out there as I'd hope. But it's like any other tool, right? You can take a hammer and build a very nice, fine piece of, craft with it, or you can take a hammer and you can smash your thumb with it. At some point it becomes, understanding how the tool works, using the tool when it's appropriate for the job, maybe knowing when the tool isn't appropriate for the job, and then, and then just kind of, having that as a tool set in your belt, right? Knowing when, hey, this is the kind of scenario. You mentioned TTL, right? If somebody does a lot of photography with Flash, hopefully they understand like, oh, this is the kind of scenario where TTL is probably going to work, or TTL might be a challenge here. And so, no, I want to override that and, make those smart decisions. And, if something can work 80% of the time, why not take advantage of it 80% of the time, right? And save yourselves 80% of the hassle. Again, with some caveats, depending on the scenario. If it's a once in a lifetime, gotta nail it this very moment shot, you gotta nail it. I understand that. But, if you're in a studio doing senior portraits, if you don't nail that one perfect shot because TTL didn't work or whatever, okay, great, switch to plan B. But if 80% of the time it works, fantastic. So,
yeah. I thought of one more area, actually, it's really two things that GoPro has done with AI in their recent models. So a lot of wedding photographers are using GoPros more for like the overhead shots or things that they want something light to put wherever, sort of like drones too. And
right.
maybe DJI has probably done this in drones as well. But so on the GoPro specifically, two areas that they implemented AI to improve on its features. One is the image stabilizer. So that is a mixture of gyros and AI in order to smooth out, and it's done a fantastic job of that. And the other is improving the audio from the tiny built-in microphone. AI has played a big role in improving that as well. So besides from facial recognition and things like that, and smart camera modes and things like that in cameras, there's little features that actually play a big role that are utilizing AI. So
yeah, that stabilization is a great one. There's somebody I follow online who's he and his wife they live in Southern California. They're way into Disneyland. They go to Disneyland all the time. They've started up a YouTube channel on Disneyland related resources and things like that. And he was recently sharing a little bit on a podcast I listened to him on about the equipment he was using. And he bought a nice, decent Sony camera. I don't remember exactly which one it is. It's one of the ones that I'm sure a bunch of the people watching this have. It was one of the, A7 something or others, and, he used that. But what he's found is for a lot of his, especially like his B-roll footage, his walking around type stuff, he shoots it on his iPhone now because the AI-based, iPhone video stabilization in there gives him better results than what he's getting from the Sony camera just walking around. Now, he probably could get a, Steadicam type thing to use with that Sony camera and all that would potentially give him a little bit more stability on that. Or maybe in the future, Sony will improve their, algorithmic video stabilization. But for the camera he had and for the results he was seeing, he found that the iPhone stabilization gave him better results right out of the camera, and it gave him the quality of footage that he needed. And so that was just less time for him to deal with in the editing process.
Yeah. Plus,
Yeah.
now he doesn't have to carry around a bulky Steadicam.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's like he's still taking the Sony to use for other footage,
Yeah.
you know, and he's got like, you know, I mean, he's got like shotgun mic and, you know, other stuff he's doing there. But, you know, but what he found is for that particular purpose, you know, the iPhone with the AI stabilization gave him better results with less. Yeah, and like you said, I mean, especially if you're going to go walk around, right? I mean, a Steadicam is not lightweight by default. They're heavy on purpose, right?
Yep, exactly.
Heavy and bulky generally, and so you know, if a computer can do something that was previously only possible with a big piece of heavy equipment, fantastic. I'm on board with
that. So as we wrap this up, I want you to please share information. Tell me about your book, titled "The Computer Ate My Photos: Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Photography."
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I spent about 3 years, I would say, diving deep into this world. And you know, as we look at what's in the book really, I think there's really kind of 3 broad sections to it. You know, the first is just kind of an introduction to, you know, what is all this stuff, right? What do these terms mean? Why do I, you know, what do these terms mean, and why do I care? And how can they benefit me? And where are we today, right? You know, it's some of the stuff like we talked about early on about, you know, what are some of the AI technologies that exist in our current, you know, DSLRs, our mirrorless cameras, our smartphones, you know, our computers, right? Where are we at right now? Kind of the middle section of the book is a look at, with where we're at right now, what are some of kind of the detailed applications of that we can take of today? And what is that going to enable in the future, right? So, you know, there's a whole chapter that talks about metadata, right? Which I referenced earlier as, you know, I mean, obviously, you know, if you go back a long time, metadata was little notes you made on a notepad when you were out with your film camera in the field, because your film camera didn't capture any of that automatically. And then, you know, so when you were looking at your print or your slide later and you were trying to figure out, man, I overexposed that. What were the settings on that shot? Well, it's because you wrote it all down in your notebook was the only way you knew that. Well, digital cameras have started to capture, you know, a lot of that metadata for us automatically around exposure and, you know, and now if you've got a camera or a smartphone with GPS in it, you get location data. You know, and I talked about how, you know, if I pull that into an application, it can do object recognition, it can do facial recognition. I can tell it, hey, this is a photo of Scott, and it can find all the other photos of Scott in my image library automatically. And so a lot of those things that we used to spend time doing metadata on, I kind of talk through here's how a lot of those are going to phase out. You know, and so we kind of look at applications of what's possible now. And then the last section of the book really gets into, you know, what I think is some of the most fun discussion. And it's some of the stuff we talked about as well. Is like, what does the future look like, right? What is this going to mean for me as a photographer, you know, in the next few years? But what is this going to mean for the photography industry 5 years from now or 10 years from now? You know, am I going to get you know, I mean, the book has a section that talks about, like, you know, are you going to get automated out of a job, right? You know, but you know, what is this going to mean both from a, you know, from a technology standpoint in our cameras and our software, but also what is it going to mean for the work that we do as a photographer? You know, and that's where I start to, you know, ask some questions that I don't necessarily have an answer to, because some of this stuff does lead to bigger questions, right? If we automate all of the routine, menial, tedious tasks that we do, then all that's going to remain in theory are the like really brain intensive creative type stuff. And we know that like the human brain can't do that for 8 hours a day, right? Like we can't be in the flow or on doing crazy creative stuff, you know, 40 hours a week, to use our normal work week, right? And so like I mean, as photographers right now, that stuff is interspersed with things like, oh, copying files, updating my website, going
Yep.
through and culling images, like a bunch of stuff that doesn't necessarily exercise our brain too much. So, like, if we automate all this stuff that doesn't exercise our brain and all we're left is this crazy hard stuff that drives our brain crazy, like, what does that mean? Like, if you can't do that 40 hours a week, what are you going to fill your time with? And so there's a lot of like long-term questions. And obviously this is all within the context of photography, and the references are all kind of in the context of life as a photographer. But it also raises some interesting questions for for what our life is going to look like in the future as a whole. So yeah, so that's kind of the book. I mean, if people want to check it out, I mean, it's on Amazon. You can go search for my name or the name of the book, The Computer Ate My Photos, Artificial Intelligence, the Future of Photography. You'll find it. It's there as a Kindle or as a paperback. You can also, if you want to kind of get a free teaser, if you go to ai.techphotoguy.com, there's a page where you can basically get a free chapter of the book. And it's a chapter that's all about how artificial intelligence may impact kind of AI generated artwork in the future, right? And teaser, I tie that in with the stock photography industry. So if you're wondering what all this means for the future of stock photography, go grab that sample chapter from ai.techphotoguy.com and check that out. And there's links there to buy the book as well if you want to just grab the whole thing.
Awesome. So that link is up on the screen right now. And I am, once we wrap this up, I'm going to comment on all the live streams with a link to it directly on Amazon for everybody to check it out directly as well. Yeah, so this has been a fantastic conversation. You know me, I'm all about the techie stuff, so I'm glad that we got to hop on and talk about this. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to hang out at Imaging USA, but maybe next year, hopefully.
That's the plan, man. We've all gotten really good at understanding that plans change over the last couple of years, but like you, I'm really going to be happy when maybe things are a little bit more stable and safe. So looking forward to that.
For sure. Awesome. So. If you enjoyed this live stream with Aaron Hockley and would like to know when the next live stream is happening, then know that you are invited to be part of the bigger conversation. Join the ImagenAI community today just by going to ai.com/community. And by joining the community, you get access to exclusive conversations, live events, Q&As with the ImagenAI founders, and much more. So we hope to see you there. And the link's up on the screen. But once again, that's imagine-ai.com/community. Thank you again, Aaron, for hopping on for this awesome conversation. Yeah, I look forward to chatting with you and seeing you soon.
Hopefully, yeah. Thanks for having me. It was great to see everybody, and feel free to reach out through my website if anybody wants to connect.